What would you do if, live on national television, you received a phone call that shattered your world, and the entire country watched you fall apart in real time? That's exactly what happened to Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. One call from African President Ibrahim Traoré, and everything changed. But what started as a tragedy sparked a movement, one that quietly rewrote the rules of diplomacy, leadership, and human connection. Stay with us, because this story will move you, challenge you, and just might change how you see power forever. Dear friends, what you're about to hear is more than just a story. It's a glimpse into a world where quiet courage reshapes destinies and dignity outshines power. These are the voices often missed by the headlines, but not here. If this kind of storytelling moves you, if it stays with you long after the screen fades, we invite you to subscribe and ring the bell. And before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. We read every word. Now let's begin. It was supposed to be just another panel. The set lights were warm, the makeup was done, and the studio buzzed with the same recycled energy that usually fills live broadcasts, controlled, polished, familiar. Jasmine Crockett sat poised in her seat at a downtown Manhattan news studio, framed perfectly in camera 3, ready to weigh in on the topic of the hour, foreign aid reform and American accountability. Another cycle, another debate. But this time, something shifted, something irreversible. She was mid-sentence, articulating a point about transparency in overseas military support, when her phone vibrated in her lap. It wasn't supposed to be on, she never made that mistake, not on live TV, but something in her gut told her to glance at the screen. The name stunned her, Ibrahim Traoré. She hesitated, her mind raced. In the earpiece, the producer barked softly, "Ignore it, you're live." But her pulse had already picked up speed. She excused herself under her breath, hands trembling, and tapped the screen. She didn't say much during the call. She didn't need to. Ibrahim's voice was low, almost hollow. He never wasted words, and this time each syllable came like a blade. There had been an attack. Timbuktu, northern Mali, a school, a car bomb. American aid workers were present, at least 12 lives lost. Among them, a teacher from Chicago, 24 years old. Her name was Serena. Jasmine didn't cry right away. She just sat still, blinking, eyes unfocused, as the world around her dissolved into static. Ibrahim apologized for calling during the broadcast. He hadn't known she was live. He just thought she'd want to hear it from him, not from a headline. And then the line went dead. What happened next wasn't planned. There were no speeches, no practiced grief. The camera panned back to her face, expecting a sharp response to the debate. But the words wouldn't come. Her lips parted, then faltered. Her throat clenched. And then, quietly, in front of 3 million viewers, Jasmine Crockett cried. Not a performative tear, not a calculated pause, but a silent collapse of composure, something raw and human, the kind of grief that doesn't ask permission. The moderator froze. Her fellow panelists blinked in confusion, but the viewers, they felt it. The clip hit social media before the segment even ended. Within 30 minutes, Jasmine Crockett was trending nationwide. Within the hour, people had already begun to ask what happened, but no one could have imagined the answer. That call, those 60 seconds of shattered protocol, were more than a personal tragedy. They were a turning point, not just in Jasmine's career, but in how 2 nations, 2 leaders, and 2 very different lives would converge in the face of shared pain. At that moment, the politics of the room dissolved. The headlines didn't matter, the commentary, the cameras, the curated opinions, none of it could reach the place she'd been taken by one voice, one call, one loss. Something had broken open. And from that silence, something irreversible had just begun to form. 3 weeks before the broadcast, long before grief carved its shape into live television, Jasmine Crockett had found herself sitting alone at a small cafe in Lisbon, the kind of place where diplomats passed through in between summits, where the pastries were too perfect to be local and the coffee always too bitter to be remembered. It was a chance meeting, or so it seemed. She had been attending a closed-door policy forum hosted by a global development alliance. A long list of speakers, even longer speeches. Everyone was there to be seen, to be heard, to make statements that sounded good in newsprint but rarely touched the ground. Everyone except him. Ibrahim Traoré was not on the formal agenda. No scheduled appearance, no press availability. Word of his presence had trickled through back channels, whispered with a mix of curiosity and caution. Jasmine, intrigued and exhausted, had decided to step away from the noise, slipping down a side street, chasing quiet. And there he was, sitting alone at a corner table, no guards, no fanfare. Just a notebook, a cup of tea, and eyes that held far more years than his face suggested. Their conversation started the way most cautious diplomatic exchanges begin, with mutual politeness and filtered language. But it didn't stay there. He talked about things that weren't in the briefing documents, about how the people of northern Mali were being forgotten, how extremist groups were exploiting aid routes, how schoolgirls disappeared without headlines, how the world's loudest nations were too busy measuring influence to notice who was bleeding. He didn't ask for anything, he just wanted someone to listen. And Jasmine did. That night, as rain pattered gently on the windows, they sat in that cafe for nearly 2 hours, not as a congresswoman and a president, but as two people wrestling with the same truth from opposite ends of the earth. That power was deafening, and silence was where humanity lived. He told her about a town called Timbuktu, not the mythical version in Western imaginations, but the real one, where dusty air carried the sound of chalk on old schoolboards, where aid workers spent their evenings teaching English under gas lamps, where a bomb had already been found near a playground 2 weeks earlier. The UN hadn't responded. The embassy was vague. Ibrahim was furious in the quietest way, because he knew what would happen if no one cared. Before they left, she asked why he had spoken to her, of all people. He looked at her for a long moment and said, "Because everyone else was too busy preparing to speak." That answer stayed with her. Back in Washington, she did what she could, made calls, sent letters. Nothing made it through the wall of bureaucracy. The threat in Timbuktu was seen as unstable intelligence. It wasn't until 3 weeks later, until that phone call, until Serena's name was spoken in the middle of a broadcast, that the urgency she had tried to echo finally erupted into something the world could no longer ignore. And that cafe in Lisbon? It would become a memory Jasmine would replay in her mind for years to come. Not because of what was said, but because it marked the moment when a thread was tied, one that would stretch across continents, across governments, and into the heart of a movement no one saw coming. Grief has many faces. For Jasmine Crockett, in the days following her breakdown on national television, grief looked like silence. Not the silence of defeat, but the heavy, charged stillness that comes right before something shifts. The world had watched her weep, watched her humanize politics in a way rarely permitted, and now everyone was waiting to see what she would do next. Some said she had been manipulated, others called her unstable. The headlines ran wild with speculation, a few tried to turn her pain into political ammunition, but Jasmine didn't respond. She wasn't chasing redemption, she was searching for resolve. On the 4th day after the incident, she emerged, not on another talk show, but through a letter. Handwritten, then typed and posted online, the message was titled, "This is not weakness." It wasn't crafted for applause, it was raw, personal. She wrote about Serena, the young Chicago teacher who had died in the Timbuktu blast, and how she had only known of her for 90 seconds during that call with Ibrahim. And yet, in those 90 seconds, her death became a mirror, a call to clarity. She ended the letter with a vow, "I will not let this be forgotten." That promise became the seed for what followed. In less than a week, Jasmine launched the Timbuktu Children's Fund. It wasn't backed by a major political donor, and she didn't wait for congressional approval. She partnered with small grassroots organizations already working in Mali, teachers, midwives, local guides, and built a direct relief network that skipped red tape and ego. Her first televised appearance after the fund's creation wasn't what anyone expected. She didn't join a panel or deliver a speech. Instead, she stood alone in a darkened studio with no audience and one camera. She held a small notebook in her hands and read the names of the children and teachers who had died in the attack. Slowly, without commentary, without politics, just names, just silence between each. That broadcast was only 70 seconds long, and yet it raised more than $500,000 within 24 hours. People didn't donate because of policy. They donated because pain, when spoken plainly, becomes universal. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré watched the clip from his office on a grainy screen. He didn't say anything at first. Then he stood, walked over to a whiteboard filled with crisis response notes, and erased the entire middle section. Instead, he drew a circle and wrote in the center, "Listening Council." The idea was simple. Survivors would be the architects of the solutions, not government officials, not foreign consultants. Young people who had seen too much, who had lived through what everyone else tried to avoid. It was his way of honoring Serena, of honoring Jasmine's pain. And then, quietly, he called her again. No press, no script. "You didn't just cry," he said. "You started something." Jasmine smiled. So did you. What neither of them said, but both understood, was that this wasn't about a school bombing anymore. It wasn't even about grief. It was about how loss, when it meets love and leadership, can become a force stronger than anger, stronger than fear, a force that begins to build. They never signed a treaty. They never released a joint press statement. There were no photos of shaking hands in front of flags, no podiums flanked by interpreters, no high-profile meetings leaking to the press. But what Jasmine Crockett and Ibrahim Traoré were building quietly began to echo through places where diplomacy had long gone cold. It began with a letter, written in blue ink on thick cream stationery, sent by courier across the ocean. Ibrahim's handwriting was tight and steady, each word chosen with care. He thanked Jasmine not just for what she had done, but for how she had done it. "In a world where power so often demands to be seen," he wrote, "you chose to see others instead." Jasmine responded in kind. No staff edits, no digital signature. Just her own cursive and a story about Serena's parents, who had written her to say that for the first time their daughter's death felt like more than a headline. They felt their loss was seen, shared, honored. Those letters turned into something more. Monthly correspondence, exchanges of stories, updates, even poems, one of which Ibrahim wrote himself, titled Dust and Dignity. Jasmine kept it framed on her desk. It was through those letters that the idea of the Cape Town Roundtable emerged. Not a summit, not a conference, just a gathering, a place for people who had been taught to lead with caution, to instead lead with compassion. They chose Cape Town because of its complex soul, where freedom was fought for and rebuilt, where the soil still hummed with the weight of reconciliation. It was meant to be small, a dozen people, no more. Humanitarian workers, former child soldiers, peace educators, artists, survivors. When Jasmine and Ibrahim entered the room on the first morning, there was no applause, just a deep, reverent stillness. They didn't sit at the head. There was no head, only a circle. Each person was given the floor to speak, not to defend a policy, not to present a plan, but to share something true. Jasmine spoke of what it meant to cry in public, in a culture that rewards stoicism. Ibrahim spoke of what it felt like to lead a country scarred by histories he didn't write. Then the floor opened. A woman from Ukraine shared the memory of feeding her children during air raids. A climate refugee from the Pacific described how her home had disappeared, literally swallowed by the ocean. A retired Navy pilot from the US confessed that he had never known how to mourn the people he had once bombed. No one interrupted, no one corrected. There were no debates, only breath, truth, and the soft clatter of teacups between moments of silence. Something began to shift. Representatives from NGOs present at the edges of the room stopped taking notes and started listening. One aid director turned to her deputy and said, "We've been designing everything backward." In the weeks after, several organizations overhauled their consultation models. A youth Peace Corps was launched in West Africa, modeled directly on the listening council Ibrahim had created. In DC, young lawmakers who had once dismissed Jasmine as too quiet began adopting her methods, pausing before speaking, holding town halls that resembled more circles than campaigns. No one officially credited their influence. That was never the point. But for those who had been in that room in Cape Town, there was no doubt. Diplomacy had found its heartbeat again. Not in negotiation tables or economic incentives, but in the simple, radical act of presence. And Jasmine and Ibrahim? They didn't celebrate, they simply wrote each other again. The next letter began with 4 words, "We're not done yet." It began as a whisper, a letter here, a circle of chairs there. But 1 year later, the movement sparked by Jasmine Crockett and Ibrahim Traoré had become something else entirely. Not a political campaign, not a viral trend, but a living, breathing shift in how people understood leadership, loss, and love. No one told the media Jasmine was going to Mali. There was no press release, no official delegation. She flew quietly, arrived without ceremony, and stepped into the dry heat of Timbuktu with a small satchel and a heart full of memory. A year had passed since the bombing that changed everything. The school had been rebuilt with local hands and international funds raised in the name of those lost. And in the courtyard where rubble had once scattered, a tree now stood, bent but growing. She knelt beside it, planting her palms in the soil as if trying to feel the pulse of what remained. Around her, children played, not in silence, not in fear, but in laughter. They knew who she was. They had seen her face on posters, not as a politician, but as the woman who listened. A boy no older than 9 approached her, holding something wrapped in cloth. Inside was a carved wooden bench, perfectly miniaturized, hand-etched with swirls and patterns Jasmine didn't recognize, but somehow understood. "It's from President Ibrahim," he said softly. "He said to tell you it's for the children's library." Jasmine held the bench like an heirloom. It wasn't just a gift, it was a message, a promise. And when she entered the newly opened children's library, built beside the school, painted with sunflowers and stars, she placed it gently beneath a window where the light touched everything. Later that day, she sat with community leaders, teachers, survivors. They didn't ask her to speak, they asked her to listen, and she did, for hours. She heard stories of healing, of fear, of the long walk back to hope. One girl, maybe 11, whispered to her, "We know Serena's name because of you." That night, she wrote to Ibrahim. She told him about the bench, about the girl, about how the stars over Timbuktu looked different than any she'd seen, like they were watching something sacred unfold. Back in Burkina Faso, Ibrahim stood beside a river with a group of youth leaders. They were launching a new exchange program, that would allow students from Mali and the US to study peacebuilding together. The program would be named the Serena Initiative, its motto, "Presence is Power." Months later, a documentary filmmaker quietly began weaving together the threads, archival footage, interviews, voiceovers from the letters exchanged between Jasmine and Ibrahim. But the film was not about geopolitics. It wasn't even about war or tragedy. It was about two people who, against the current of performance and power, had chosen to make connection their compass. Two people who didn't speak the same language, didn't share a culture, didn't sit at the same tables, but still found each other in the silence between world events. When the documentary premiered at a small independent festival, the final scene was simple. Jasmine and Ibrahim sitting side by side on that same bench, now life-sized, in a garden near the library. No narration, just stillness, two hands resting side by side. The camera pulled back slowly, revealing children running, reading, rebuilding in the background. It faded to black with 6 words, "This is how history listens." And the audience, like the world, sat in silence, not because they had nothing to say, but because sometimes the greatest tribute is stillness. Conclusion. When listening changes the world. The story of Jasmine Crockett and Ibrahim Traoré isn't one you'll find printed in history textbooks or blasted across mainstream headlines. It didn't involve wars won or empires toppled. It was about something far more rare and more revolutionary. It was about what happens when two people from two worlds choose to lead not with dominance, but with deep human presence. It began with a single phone call. A tragedy in Timbuktu tore open a silence Jasmine could no longer carry, and the world watched as she broke, not in weakness, but in truth. That one emotional moment on live television was not the end of her composure. It was the beginning of her transformation. She cried not because she lacked control, but because she cared too deeply to hide it any longer. But behind that moment was something far more intentional. A quiet meeting in Lisbon, weeks before the headlines, where Jasmine chose to listen when others dismissed. Ibrahim, frustrated by global inaction, found in her not just an American lawmaker, but a mirror, a mind willing to hear the pain of a distant people and carry it home with her. That bond turned pain into purpose. Jasmine launched the Timbuktu Children's Fund, speaking names instead of making speeches. Ibrahim built listening councils, empowering survivors to guide policy. Their relationship never fit the mold of traditional diplomacy, but in doing so it redefined what diplomacy could be. Together they convened a roundtable in Cape Town, sat among survivors, and listened. Not to debate, not to argue, but to feel. And from that circle, new models were born, ones that elevated empathy over ego. 1 year later, Jasmine's journey to Mali and Ibrahim's youth peace program weren't just acts of goodwill. They were proof that when leaders slow down, step back and show up with intention, healing begins. Presence is power. Not the kind of power that dominates a room, but the kind that changes it simply by being real. Jasmine and Ibrahim taught us that the world doesn't change when we speak louder, it changes when we care deeper. So how can you apply this? Start by truly listening, at work, at home, even with strangers. Pause before reacting. Ask questions you don't already know the answers to. Be curious, not for the sake of control, but for connection. You don't need to lead a country to shape someone's world. You just need to make someone feel heard. Let's turn that into a question for you. Which kind of leadership do you personally believe is more powerful? A. Leading with presence and empathy. B. Leading with authority and command. Comment. A or B below. We want to hear your thoughts and spark a conversation with others in the community. And more importantly, we want to know, what did this story mean to you? Did it change how you see politics, grief, leadership, or even yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. And if this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue telling stories that don't just inform, but truly inspire. We're building something meaningful here, and we're glad you're part of it.